Okay, good afternoon everybody, and thanks for tuning in for another Helix Essential Series chat. Today I've got the pleasure in talking to Michael Roberts, the Queensland Regional Executive Director of the HIA. Thanks for making your time available, Michael.
Thanks for the invitation.
So I just thought we might kick off with just telling everybody a little bit about the Michael Roberts story, your background and how you found your way to the HIA.
Sure. So I'm a town planner by profession. Started my career back in the late 80s, I suppose, with Brisbane City Council as a town planner with the council in a number of roles. I was there for just over 16 years and then found my way to HIA to take up the role as the resident town planner. I think HIA at the time had the view that town planners were a significant thorn in the building industry side, and they might as well have one on staff that could give them some inside knowledge on how the industry or that part of the industry works. So I've been with HIA just on 16 years as well, and the last 2 years as in this role as the Executive Director for Queensland.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but town planners by nature I've always found them very structured and orderly and, project focused, if I can call it that. How have you transitioned into the leading role of the HIA where issues come at your left, right and centre?
Yeah, look, it's my experience working in local government in a different range of roles was that the town planners tended to be the go-to person when no one else knew the answer. And so you do become a bit of a generalist. And so when I came over to HIA, I found myself in very familiar territory because when issues arose and it didn't quite sit in the technical area or it didn't quite sit in the legal area, everybody came knocking on my door. So it was pretty familiar ground, and certainly taking on this role where, on any given day, you can be dragged into a whole range of arguments. It does exercise the mind, there's no doubt about that, but it's not something I'm unfamiliar with.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure you can adapt very well. So let's just start off with the most topical issue, which this is purely from my perspective, so as some clarity. Can you just provide us with some information to the best of your knowledge of what the situation is with the, if I can call it the Queensland, New South Wales building bubble, in terms of how that's been rolled out, and if there's any last minute adjustments or any sort of updates you can give us in terms of how that's been implemented?
Sure. So the Queensland government is quite nervous about the fact that the virus is slowly creeping north from Sydney. And we all know it's in Newcastle, which isn't too far south. And they're a little bit worried about the fact that the New South Wales government still allows people to travel fairly freely within the state. And so they've put in place some measures to try and protect Queensland. They've come up with this interesting solution where they're calling it a border zone. I refer to it as a bubble that runs from Tweed Heads on the New South Wales side of the border to around Beenleigh on the Gold Coast. And people within that bubble are allowed to travel across the New South Wales border with a permit. But if you're outside that bubble, you're not allowed to cross the border. So people to the south of Tweed Heads are not allowed into Queensland, and people north of the Gold Coast aren't allowed to travel across the border into New South Wales. It's an interesting concept. It has, there's some logic to it. There's no doubt about that. We know that people who live on the border and work or have kids that go to school on the other side have had some challenging times over the last few months. But it has created some frustrations. I think the government underestimated or doesn't have a very good understanding of how mobile our industry is and how far builders and trades travel on a daily basis to get to a job site. So, we've been, since those measures were implemented, at 1 a.m. Saturday morning with about 24 hours notice, we've been inundated with phone calls from builders who live on the Gold Coast and are doing work south of the Tweed, Brunswick Heads, Byron Bay, Ballina. There's a lot of work going on in those regions, and a lot of the work is being undertaken by builders and trades that live on the Gold Coast. And, the rule is that if you're a Queenslander and you go over the New South Wales border and you travel beyond the bubble, then the only way you can return is via plane, and you have to isolate for 2 weeks. And so that's causing quite a bit of distress to many of our members because that's their livelihood. And while we understand we're trying to keep the virus out of Queensland, I think the speed at which that measure was introduced, has caused some challenges. And here we are on Wednesday, and we're still getting phone calls from people saying, "What's this? What's this about the border being closed? What am I hearing?" So they're still just becoming aware of it, and that's a real challenge.
Outside school holidays, the trip from the Gold Coast down to Byron Bay with those road improvements is not a hard drive in terms of, the mobility. I suppose I'm talking about the mobility in terms of how quickly. So it's certainly not. It's not a hard drive, People, the contractors in Sydney would be doing harder stuff driving from the North Shore to the east of the suburbs rather than a drive from the Gold Coast to south of the bubble at the moment. So it doesn't surprise me that there's a lot of contractors who have been able to expand their reach, well down the New South Wales border. What are they doing? So they've got contracts on foot. I presume that they'll be able to have some local subcontractors that might be around inside New South Wales be able to go to those sites, but they're not going to be able to supervise or anything like that, are they? Unless they want to then drive down to Newcastle, get in the plane and fly back and spend 2 weeks in quarantine.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and so we've got some builders who've said, well, I'm taking the caravan and I'm going to New South Wales and I'll camp in the caravan and wait it out, finish the job, and deal with how I return to home when that eventuates. We're in the process of actually setting up a bit of what I'm calling a dating service. So we're doing exactly what you just mentioned. We're going to set up a spreadsheet of trades that are based in New South Wales, and see if we can, create a dating service to pair them up with builders based on the Gold Coast.
Sorry, I lost a little bit of that. The connection went down, but I think I can guess what you said. Okay, and the other thing too, as I read, and I don't know if there's any truth, the comment was it's easier for New South Wales people to travel into Queensland rather than Queensland people go down to New South Wales. Is that any truth in that? Why would that be the case? Just questioning what I read.
Yeah, look, I saw that comment in the media as well, and I wasn't really sure where that was coming from, other than, if someone from New South Wales can come into Queensland and turn around and go home, and they won't be required to quarantine.
Quarantine.
Yeah. Whereas
so it is
coming back into Queensland, you will be required to quarantine.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the difference. Just the quarantine is it? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, good luck with that one. Good luck to everybody who's out there trying to juggle that. Mind you, a caravan somewhere down in Byron Bay, I could probably make that work. Okay, let's move on to the home building stimulus, or the I forget what the proper name was, the federal government or the Commonwealth government came out and delivered in terms of the support for the industry. Have you got any early feedback or any sort of anecdotal evidence or even any sort of hard statistics in terms of how to what extent has that been taken up?
Yeah, so we became quite concerned. We have an economics team within HIA that sort of continually analyses data, sales data. We also sell contracts through HIA, and that gives us a bit of an indicator of what the level of activity is as well. And we became quite concerned very early on in the piece back in March about what we were seeing and what the likely drop in activity was going to be for the fourth quarter of the year. And so we approached the federal government and said that we believed there was a need for stimulus because the drop was going to be significant. And I think from memory in Queensland here, we were predicting over a 40% drop. And thankfully, the federal government came to the party with their home builder scheme. It's been a frustrating process because they announced the scheme on the 4th of June, and that created an immediate rush from consumers wanting to take advantage of that $25,000. And the feedback...
the contracts had to be signed by between when and when? And
so up until the scheme runs until the 31st of December.
Yep.
And there's a requirement that construction start within 3 months
That's right.
of the contract being signed. So, on the 5th of June, the builders reported that the phone started ringing and traffic was back in the display villages almost immediately. The frustrating part was it was a 2-month period of uncertainty because while the federal government was providing the finances for the scheme and they put in place a framework for how they wanted to see it run, ultimately it was up to the states to fine-tune that. And we had to wait 2 months for the Queensland government to release the rules and an application form so that we could actually get on with it. Now, thankfully that's up and running. And the builders can actually get on and start doing some work. As I said, anecdotal feedback is that the builders have been swamped with applications, and the biggest handbrake would appear to be access to blocks of land that are ready to be built. So we're hearing lots of stories from builders, particularly outside of southeast Queensland in the more regional areas. I was talking to a builder yesterday in Hervey Bay. They'd signed 9 contracts, but they've got another 9 clients who are desperate to sign a contract, but there are no blocks of land left in and around Hervey Bay. So,
is that Hervey Bay, is it?
Yeah.
Because I think when I was speaking to Paul Bidwell from the Master Builders Association, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but if you bundle all together the state home building grants and this particular grant, that comes to about $45,000 if you built in the regions.
Yeah, there's a $15,000 first home buyer's grant, and then there's an extra little bit on top of that if it's in a regional area. So yeah, I think it is 45,000. Yeah. So it's significant. So
that's counterintuitive for someone who could be attracted to go to Hervey Bay with an extra with an incentive of $45,000 in their kitty, but then to be sort of be delayed through not being able to find any land.
Yeah, and it's it was something we became concerned about pretty quickly. And I mean, I spoke to a couple of the major well-known land developers that operate in southeast Queensland, and they all reported that there was likely to be a shortage, certainly in the short term, and they were scrambling to identify sites that they might be able to bring on before the 31st of December deadline.
So maybe I keep on reading in the papers that there's a possibility or strong possibility that the scheme will be extended So maybe it's also not just a matter of extending the scheme time-wise, but it might be necessary to look at the entry criteria, if I can call it that, the time in which is required to start after signing, or something, something like that. Something to recognise the fact that there's some handbrakes in terms of the availability of land in some areas.
Yeah, so the feds did give the state some flexibility around being able to extend that 3-month period, and the state has included that in their scheme, but and they take into account delays with approvals and access to finance and that sort of thing, which is great. But that not being able to find a block of land is not an acceptable excuse. So, look, it would be a shame if the benefit of the scheme was limited because we couldn't get access to enough blocks of land.
Because in a way that produces a bit of a skewed outcome, because when I was talking to Andrew Wallace, who's obviously the federal member official for the Sunshine Coast, he was all very happy about it and everything like that. But the feedback he was getting from the builders up there, which I presume would be the bigger project builders, we've already the land issue already sorted out. It wouldn't be a problem for that type of demographic, or that particular area where you're talking about the builders have already got the sort of land already available, ready to be chosen, so to speak.
Look, I'm not sure. Stockland, who owns significant land holdings on the Sunshine Coast, I did speak to them, and they at the time told me that they probably had about 12 weeks of land at the take-up rate, but they were very hopeful of being able to bring on additional stages before the 31st of December. Avid Property Group reported, making a month's worth of sales in a weekend.
Yeah.
So the uptake has probably been unprecedented. I think it probably caught everybody by surprise, and the land developers were no different to any other business. Once COVID hit, they wound back their activities, and so they were probably caught on the hop, like everybody else. Fingers crossed. They've got other stages that were ready to go, and they can get on and bring them to market.
They can kickstart again quickly, hopefully. Yeah, okay, I see the point is that they probably did go reverse or stop for a period of time, and then this incentive came, which means they had to sort of remobilise again, mobilise again. So if there was an extension, you'd probably think that they'd be better equipped post in the January period to be able to fully exploit the opportunities, you would think. Okay, couple of other issues. Issue which I've been following closely for a couple of years now is in relation to I call it the private certification PI insurance crisis. Certifiers have to be licensed in Queensland. They're required with the QBCC, and they're required to have PI insurance. But they haven't been able to get PI insurance for full coverage, particularly in relation to combustible cladding. So there's been an exemption carved out for them. Now, I think I read some sort of minutes of a meeting the other day which was published on the Department of Housing, Public Works and Housing website, where the previous signalled intentions was that I think it was June next year the exemption was in place, but it's been agreed that would be extended for another 12 months. I haven't seen anything come out other than the minutes of the meetings on the department's website. But can you add any sort of clarity or better explain it to them what I have just done?
Sure. So there's been a significant shift in the insurance world in the last 2 years. And so a lot of what's happening here actually started overseas. And instructions were issued from head offices in England, etc., that the businesses here were to look at all their products that were high risk and low cost. And probably most of the insurance products that get sold into the building industry fit those two criteria.
Not many things outside that.
Yeah. And unfortunately, certification and the insurance that's required was at the top of the list. And so early last year, certifiers saw their premiums going from, the sort of $10,000 to $15,000 range to $40,000 to $60,000. And these are small businesses. These are 1 and 2 man shows. So that's a lot of extra money that they have to generate just to cover the insurance and their ability to stay in business. And in addition to that, the clauses that were being included in the premiums were fairly limiting. And, the result has been that the certifiers feel they're now in the position that if they make one mistake, they're out of business. And so we were, as an industry, I was pretty nervous about what was going to happen because without certifiers in Queensland, we don't have a building industry. And while the government, reminded us that local authorities, councils, were under the legislation were certifiers of last resort. So despite the fact most local governments got out of certification many years ago, the legislation still says that you can walk into any council and lodge a building application. Now, the reality is when you do that, the council will accept your application. They will then open the yellow pages and find a local private building certifier to assess that application for you. So it was a bit frustrating because the state said, oh, look, don't worry, it's all okay because local governments, are the certifier of last resort. But there aren't any councils in Queensland that still run a certification business. They all got out of it a long time ago. And, when we spoke to the councils, they all went, apart from the fact very few of them had any appetite to get back into that business. They all said, oh, we're not resourced, we don't even have any desks we can sit certifiers at, where would we put them? And so there was a fair bit of panic in the second half of last year about what was going to happen. The QBCC, you're quite right, there's a requirement under the QBCC legislation that certifiers have to be licensed and they have to have insurance. The QBCC, to their credit, took a fairly pragmatic approach and said, we will not cancel anybody's licence just because they haven't been able to obtain appropriate insurance. So providing they make their application, providing they pay their licence fee and providing they supply us with evidence saying, this is what they've been quoted, we will take that under consideration for a period of time. So it was, as I said, it was probably a pragmatic approach under fairly difficult circumstances. Feedback this year so far is that premiums haven't continued to increase. So they appear to have stayed at about the same level. Now, whether, that's a cost on the business, and whether that ongoing cost is sustainable in the long term, I'm not sure. There were a lot of certifiers that I spoke to who said, oh, I'm getting too old for this rubbish. It might be time to get out. And that's an additional concern with the certification profession, is that most of them are middle-aged.
Yep.
There's not a lot of young people getting into the certification profession. And so it's an additional straw that will eventually break the camel's back, I think. So It's not an issue that's gone away. I think it has been swept aside by COVID and some other things, but it's certainly sitting there as a bit of a sleeper issue that we need to keep a very close eye on.
Yeah, I should have pulled it up before, but there's published minutes of the Ministerial Construction Council, and there was on the Department of Housing, Public Works and Housing website, and I noticed a comment saying that in that forum it had been decided that another 12 months be given because of the COVID situation. So that kicks the can down the road till June 22, if I've sort of got it right.
Okay.
So, but I haven't seen anything else come out other than that, to provide some detail other than that minuted comment. It's a bit. What council would get insurance to insure a business unit of certifiers in these days?
Exactly. I mean, if the private building certifies, you would imagine that the same rules would apply to a local government who was trying to get insurance.
Sure. And the other thing too is it's such a pivotal point in terms of certifiers pay, not just a pivotal point in terms of standards and all that sort of stuff, but it's a point of cash flow. A lot of contracts are set up for the attainment of a particular outcome, which generates a payment. So you've got to have a sufficient source of certifiers doing their job promptly, so that you don't have any sort of impediments in terms of the flow of monies down the contractual chain. I think the whole thing was prefaced on the basis that hopefully in a couple of years' time, with the tightening up of the banning of some of the questionable products, which is a great idea, the insurance industry would have a better appetite to provide affordable insurance. Is that the way? That's the sort of strategy that I saw? First we need time to ban the products. If we ban the products from being able to use, well then there hopefully will be more of a appetite for the insurers to provide insurance.
Yeah, that's the hope. And I mean, the federal government's undertaking a Better Buildings program, reviewing the legislation and looking at what other processes could be put in place just to tighten things up a little bit. And there's no doubt that the legislation could be improved in Queensland, particularly around, the class 2 and 3 buildings. So that, the high-rise apartment buildings is, the inspection requirements for those classes of building are reasonably loose compared to the inspection requirements for a house. So it makes quite a bit of sense to sort of put some rigour around the inspection requirements on those bigger buildings, which is where the problem is. Yeah. The problem is predominantly with those high-rise residential and commercial buildings, and it's ironic that the inspection requirements attached to the construction of those buildings are looser than building a house. I think we need to look at some of the licensing requirements as well. I had a lot of certifiers tell me, they'd approached the QVCC and said, look, modify my licence. I got out of doing inspections on high-rise buildings years ago. I only do houses. So put a restriction on my licence to limit me to doing houses, and that will help me address my insurance. But the QVCC was unwilling to do that at the time. And that might be something that needs to be looked at. It doesn't solve the problem, but certification businesses would then be making a commercial decision based on the type of work they want to undertake and the risk profile attached to that work.
Yeah. One of the issues that I spoke to Paul Bidwell about was, it's sort of combined, is is that we've still got to see the final rollout of the Safer Buildings initiative in terms of how many buildings are going to actually be identified at the end of the day. They're going to be really problematical in terms of the removal of the combustible cladding and then the fix. And one of the issues associated with that is that I wouldn't like to be a certifier certifying that remedial work in this environment, even if they had the PIA coverage.
Yeah, exactly. We haven't been given exact numbers from the government on how many buildings are likely to be impacted. There was a thought that Queensland was better placed, certainly, than Melbourne and Sydney. And the numbers were likely to be, the buildings that were going to be seriously affected, there wasn't going to be too many of them. But you're right. What certifier in their right mind would put their hand up and say, yeah, I'll certify that you can take that material off and put this one on and you've solved the problem?
Yeah, not me.
No, that's right.
And that leads into a non-certifying issue, but who's going to pay for it in terms of the rectification costs? So I think that's something to watch down the road in terms of the final rollout of that whole program. In terms of, for what it's worth, I think Paul Bidwell indicated he thought there'd probably be about 100 buildings, but not all seriously, problematical. But that's still going to cause a lot of heartache for a lot of people at some point in time.
Yeah, the number that sticks in my mind is we were told that there might have been 20 to 25 buildings that had a significant problem, and that there were a bunch of other buildings that had minor issues that may or may not have required any remediation at all. That it potentially could be dealt with by just alerting the owners and the occupiers that there was a particular cladding on the building that was flammable.
Okay, I got a few questions. I might start trying to knock some of those off. What are the key challenges, hurdles that the HIA are experiencing with builder licensing in Queensland? Is it working? Is it not working? So that's a broader question than just certification.
Yeah, big question, and we'll probably spend quite a while talking about it. I do think there's a need to review the licensing regime in Queensland. For a couple of reasons. First of all, we're seeing a whole range of new materials come onto the market aimed at either increasing energy efficiency or, they're lightweight materials, so they're potentially quicker to erect, or there might be some cost savings involved in some panelised systems. And our licensing system isn't really geared up to deal with that. So the response from the regulator, the QBCC, when we've spoken to them about this is, well, a carpenter can put that product up. But even with some of the growing popularity of steel framing, I mean, it's just, that product arrives to site. It's like a Meccano set for those that are of a similar age to me and can remember what a Meccano set is. But, our view is you don't need to be a fully qualified carpenter to put up a steel frame. So I think there's a need to review the licensing regime to take into account that things have changed, that we're dealing with new systems, we're dealing with new products, and perhaps there's the opportunity to review the licensing requirements to operate with that. We see very few instances these days where a trade takes on the full range of skills that they might have done traditionally. On most work sites now, the trades tend to specialise, so you'll have the guys that come in and put up the frame and the trusses. You'll have different guys that come in and do windows and doors and cabinetry and those sorts of things. You'll have a different team that puts the cladding on. So it raises questions, and we continually debate the issue about, what skills an apprentice should have. You know, do they need to be doing a 3 or 4 year apprenticeship? Or perhaps they could start out with, you know, something much shorter and they specialise in one area. And obviously their licence would reflect that, and then they choose whether they want to expand that expertise and expand the licence as they go on. I think the other issue is there has been a tightening of the requirements around getting a licence in Queensland, and that's not, I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing,
yeah.
But I think we need some clarity around what, you know, what the barrier or what the benchmark is for getting a licence, and it can be frustrating. We're helping a client or a member at the moment who's come up from New South Wales, has over 25 years experience building in New South Wales, is currently undertaking $30 to $40 million of work in New South Wales, and we are having a debate with the QBCC about whether he has the suitable skills and qualifications to get a licence in building for Queensland. And the hurdle seems to be the fact that he did a degree more than 10 years ago, and the QBCC doesn't think that's acceptable. So, you know, we need to be practical. We need to be careful that we're not chasing highly skilled people out of the industry, because God knows we need them, just because of, you know, some black and white interpretation of a line in a piece of legislation.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. No, I spent 22 years working with the BSA and the QBCC, so I'm a strong supporter of a robust licensing regime, but I also share the same concerns that you've just very well articulated there. I think there's a need for just licensing regimes everywhere to recognise the construction industry is going to change, or is certainly going to change, probably even more so now as a result of COVID, because of some forced innovation, and that's probably going to be one of the good things that will come out of COVID, if there's any good thing. But even before COVID, you know, I was writing articles and reading about the need to for having future fit regulation, which recognises the innovation that's going to happen in the construction industry. And one thing that excuse me, one thing that always stood out to me was, I read an article once where it was predicted that 40% of what's done on site now will be done off site by 2025 in terms of, you know, off site manufacturing. So, you know, cross-laminated timber and all that sort of stuff is largely done in a manufacturing environment and shipped to sites just like you described and bolted together like a Meccano set. And 25 King Street here in Brisbane was an example of a cross-laminated timber building. You know, the skill set required to bolt those together, doesn't fit a traditional carpenter, plumber, whatever it is, because a lot of the services are already plugged into what's going to come up already, you know what I mean? So
yeah,
it's definitely something which I agree needs to be looked at. But for one, you know, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have licensing. I think we should have licensing, but and the other thing too is that I think you articulated it pretty well, is that all licensing bodies, all regulators, not just need to be able to communicate to the industry as well as consumers what their expectations, what the standards are, what the policy requirements are. And I think there's room for all regulators to do better in that space. And I was reading this afternoon, there's been an Auditor General's report into the licensing regime into Queensland, published just recently, and it's got a lot of insightful stuff there around this. But the thing that one of the takeaways that I took around it was just regulators, all regulators, particularly in this instance the QBCC, has got to be able to communicate what the expectations are, what the standards are, what the policy is, and you know, basically be consistent in the application of that.
Absolutely. Then, you know, it's extremely frustrating. I mean, we work in an environment that's very heavily regulated, and So, you know, getting your head around what the rules are is really important. And, you know, I've had, over the years, I've had a lot of members say to me, you know, Michael, for God's sake, we just want to know what the bloody rules are. Tell us what the rules are, for God's sake, you know. And so it's extremely frustrating when you're dealing with any regulator and you've read the legislation, you think you've got a handle on it, and then you go in and oh, you know, that's not quite how we interpret that, or well, yes, that's what the legislation says, but we've got this policy that says we can interpret it another way. And I mean, at the end of the day, you know, this impacts upon people's businesses and their livelihoods. And, you know, I would have thought there was a responsibility to, you know, to make sure everybody was operating off a level playing field, that everybody understood what the rules were. And it also gives you the opportunity at a point in time to say, well, maybe we need to change that rule.
Yeah.
And you can actually point to a line in a piece of legislation or a clause, and you can say, we need to review that. It's not operating the way we thought it would, or it's out of date or whatever. When these bottom drawer policies keep being dragged out, you're not sure where that's come from, you're not sure how it originated, you're not sure whether that's the personal interpretation of the officer that you're dealing with. Does it actually reflect the position of the government of the day? You're not sure, and so it's very difficult to then have a conversation around what needs to change or identify how we go about changing something.
And it's so vital in this now, in the next year or two, because it's one thing to have stimulus and incentives to try to, you know, to generate enough activity to drag us out of this recession. But what you don't want is, you don't want to see any regulatory handbrakes stopping that momentum. So it was important before, but I just think it's so important that the regulation of the construction industry be looked at holistically, and it'd be looked at in the context of almost like a COVID extended. This is the way I'd want to see it. You know, if we think this COVID recession is going to go for 2 or 3 years, then let's commit to some decisions now that we are going to regulate the industry like this at least for the next 2 or 3 years. And if that means some sort of wavering of stuff, some softening of, you know, some application sort of softening, or some regulatory changes, then let's do it, and do it quickly, and send the message out, and then let the industry be regulated with that degree of certainty.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
So just ticking through the questions. Okay, here's another one. Does the HIA foresee that CPD for licensed builders will be eventually and ultimately be introduced into Queensland?
In a word, yes, I do. So we've been involved this year as part of a working group organised and facilitated by the QBCC to look at developing a CPD framework for Queensland, and that framework has been given to the Minister. We've got an election at the end of October, so it's highly unlikely we'll see any announcements in the near future, and I certainly don't expect anything this year, and then depending on the outcome of the election, I'm not sure we'll see anything next year, but I do believe it's inevitable. It's been recommended by the federal government review as part of a mechanism to address failure in buildings and non-conforming products and all that sort of thing. And I think there's a role for it. It's, you know, as I said before, we work in this extremely complex regulatory environment, and you know, a lot of the guys that have come into the industry, they do a Cert 3 or a Cert 4, and they get a license from the QBCC, and then they sort of wander out and start operating a business. And in the background, the standards are changing, the legislation's changing, and you'd have to question whether they're staying up to date with what current practices are, even from the stance of how to run a business. We've talked about licensing requirements. I mean, how do you stay up to date with what the licensing requirements are? Governments, as they do, want to introduce new legislation. How do you ensure that the industry is staying up to date with all that? So I do think that there is a role for it, and yes, I do think it's coming.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest frustrations of my life in terms of, like, I joined the BSA in the mid-90s, and there was discussions and working parties around, the introduction of CPD. It's one of those issues where, if there's ever an example of kicking an issue down the road and not addressing it and paying a price, we're paying that price right now. CPD is just so important. If you're going to have a licensing regime, it's got to have CPD attached to it. Because the example you gave before about the problem that you're having, that member get licensed with the 10-year-old degree, well, there'd be people out there operating now with that same degree.
Yeah.
So, if there's a concern of letting somebody come in who's can demonstrate that they've been, on the tools for a long period of time in New South Wales, I'm not just talking about a dormant person, with a qualification, and they're saying, no, we don't think that qualification is current enough to reflect modern building standards, because that's really what they're saying.
Yep.
Well, then what's happening with exactly the same people operating in Queensland now with that same degree?
Exactly. Or someone who doesn't even have that degree.
Or doesn't even have that degree. So it's,
yep.
It's like, this is where you get this inconsistency. If you start adjusting the entry points and not keep on it, if those entry points are valid, if that's right, if there's a discussion that qualification is always not relevant, well, let's settle that first. But then, okay, well, how do you then address all the people that are currently, all the 90-odd thousand or 100,000 people that are already licensed with old qualifications? The only way you can do it is if you introduce a CPD program.
Yeah. And I think it's important to mention, it needs to be well run. It needs to be structured. There are some CPD programs running around the country, and I'm not sure that buying some books or attending a barbecue and standing around and listening to a manufacturer supplier spruik their latest product should qualify you for some CPD points. So, I think we need to, if it's going to be implemented, it needs to be undertaken seriously. It needs to address shortages or skill shortages or issues that are occurring within the industry that are common. And it needs to be quite targeted. Otherwise it can become a bit of a joke. And,
it can't be a Mickey Mouse type thing.
No.
So this is the problem, is if it's dumbed down too much, it becomes Mickey Mouse. If the perception is it's too onerous, the blowback's going to be, it's just, well, we haven't got the time, or there's not enough of these courses available in a user friendly way, which. So that's starting to rapidly disappear because of the fact that you can do so much stuff online now, as we've demonstrated in the last period of time, that we can basically produce an economy on time, economy on time online. So, and that certainly opens up that sort of CPD upskilling when you can do stuff online, which was always the problem many years ago.
And that's important, Michael. I mean, we're geographically diverse state, so we need to make sure that whatever system's put in place accommodates for people who live in Mount Isa and Charleville and in western and northern parts of Queensland who may not have access to reliable internet, may face a couple of hours in a car to get to a centre that's of a size that can deliver the training. We need to be mindful that there are lots of guys and girls working in remote communities that need access to the necessary tools as well. But look, the technology's there, it's improving all the time. It shouldn't be a barrier. It's just a matter of keeping that in mind when the scheme's developed.
So from the HIA's perspective, are you it's an opportunity to plug yourself here, I suppose. Are you confident, or are you happy with the service that you can provide your members in terms of getting across the licensing requirements?
Well, as far as a training program, any sort of training program is concerned, I think.
But helping members, like you gave the example of the bloke coming from other states. So I presume he's HIA member. He's having the problems with the regulator, and you're trying to facilitate some sort of solution to the whole thing. So is that something that you see as important from a membership perspective in terms of helping your members deal with not just the QBCC, but maybe workplace health and safety and some of the other regulators around?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's probably one of the key benefits of being a member of an association. Is that's what we're here to do. And I've said it a couple of times already, the regulatory environment and the policy environment that the industry works within is extremely complex. And I've got a team of people here that spend 90% of their day trolling new pieces of legislation and producing fact sheets and guidelines for how the new rules are going to affect the industry, how it needs to be implemented on the side. This COVID period, I think we've ramped up the amount of communication to members by, probably 2 or 3-fold, which, has been extremely well received. My concern is that we've created a new benchmark or expectation amongst members for the level of communication that they expect. And I'm wondering how sustainable that is from our point of view, because this year's been exhausting and we're only halfway through it. But I get really concerned when I talk to guys and they say, "Oh, look, I don't want to be part of an association. I can't see any value in the membership." Well, how the hell are you staying up to date with everything that's going on? My team, it's their full-time job, and at times we struggle to understand and get our head around the new requirements. How the hell does a bloke whose main focus is on the tools out on a building site, and then at night he's trying to do his books and deal with clients, when does he have time to get his head around what the changes in requirements are? So, look, absolutely, you need to be part of an association, and whether it's Master Builders or whether it's HIA or whether it's another association, I think it's really important, and I think it's going to become more important because I can't see any government. We always have a joke that governments embark on red tape reduction schemes, and I've never seen one of them result in less red tape. They always seem to result in more.
Queensland, we love regulation in Queensland, irrespective of the political party. And I think it's probably got to do with the fact that we haven't got an upper house. So it's you just got the one chair. Yes, you've got committees and everything like that, but compared to say New South Wales, where they've got, quite frankly, a nuttier upper house, we can rocket through legislation like anything in this state.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's a bit of a concern.
It's one of the issues that so I've written lots of articles where I've actually been semi-critical of contractors not making their voice known about, in my particular sort of sweet spot, has been the security of payment reforms. And, it's yelling and screaming and shouting at the 11th hour is not the time to be doing the yelling and screaming. The yelling and screaming should be done during the consultation phases. Now, I know sometimes those consultation phases are almost buried. That's probably a bit harsh on the governments, but there just seems to be a continuous cycle of consultation. So you've got to be alert to it. Now, one way that individual contractors can do is to hook into an association who are keeping their eyes open for what's proposed to happen now that could bite contractors on the backside in a couple of years' time, and then feed information out about those proposals and then get some sort of feedback. So that's the value of the industry associations. I'm consistently writing articles just saying, get engaged, people, please get engaged. It's your industry. And normally fighting the 11th hour with a government is it's hard yards, and lots of times it's fruitless, where the battle should be done right up front. When someone's got an idea and it's not a good idea, well, then the industry needs to pour onto it right away, so it doesn't even get any sort of oxygen. And industry associations, to my way of thinking, play such a pivotal role in alerting their members of legislative proposed changes which are not going to hit them now, but potentially going to hit them in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, and you've touched on a couple of really important issues there, and you're right. I mean, I think, people in the industry don't understand that we often fight battles for years. I mean, you mentioned the Project Trust legislation. I mean, that I'll call it a conversation, to be polite, but that's been going on for over 3 years. We've been telling members about it for 3 years. We've been keeping them up to date. The time frame that the government has issued is not going to bite the majority of our members for another 2 years. But I will guarantee that when it does bite them, they'll be screaming from the rooftop saying, "When did this happen? Why didn't you tell us about this?"
Yep.
So communicating with the industries or how you communicate, and the best way to do that occupies quite a bit of our time. It's difficult. There is no one single stream that we can rely on. We have to use multiple streams. Hard copy, electronic copy, text messages, emails. We have to use them all to have any sort of confidence that we've got the message out there. But it is surprising how many members come back to us, and I mentioned right at the start with the border controls. We've got members, talking to us today saying, "When did this happen?" Well, we did put a member alert out Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
But I understand they're busy people. They're working on site. They may only turn their computer on once a week and check their emails.
Yeah. It's something
a challenge.
It's something we're very big about, or I'm very big about, in terms of trying to unpack information in a sort of contractor friendly manner, which obviously means no legal talk, but disseminate it so it's understandable. I'll scare you a little bit in terms of the security of payment, because it's something which the original discussion paper that kicked this round of security of payment reform, which is the BIFA amendment bill, which was passed by Parliament on the 15th of this last month. It was a December 2012 discussion paper.
There you go.
So I've written articles where it's just one discussion paper refers to another discussion paper, refers to another discussion paper, refers to another discussion paper. The original one that kicked this whole cycle off was December 2012. And if you look at the intended implementation, which is not the legislative implementation of trust, it doesn't finish until January 2023. So my point is 10 years. 10 years from a thought bubble being articulated in a discussion paper, which may or may not have got much attention, but I can absolutely advise that it was issued. It was the starting process. and then it went through this sort of this prism to end up now with and you're right, contractors potentially in January 2023 might be saying to you, when did this happen?
Well, 10 years is potentially a generation of trades, isn't it? So, we'll have people coming into the industry. They might have come in this year, they might come in next year, that will be affected by this legislation, and they'll say, why didn't you tell me about this? And we'll say, to your point, I was sitting there as you were saying that, and I was thinking, it's actually more than 3 years. I'm getting old, and I probably need to double everything.
Well, it was 3 years from that BIFA bill being introduced in 2017. Absolutely right. Yeah. But that the BIFA bill that was amended the other day doesn't have locked in timeframes. It's only got intentions because they postponed the timeframes quite correctly because of COVID. So the only thing that's in that package is contained in the second reading speech, which says the minister quite clearly articulates an intended scheduling rollout, which is not completed until January 23. But
just to give you the hot off the presses information based on a meeting we attended yesterday, that is the time frame they intend moving forward with.
Yeah.
This week.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the dilemma with a contractor. So we're critical of contractors. That's a 10-year time span that a contractor's got to stay across an issue which could bite them on the bum. You know what I mean? So this is where industry associations playing a really strategic and nuanced role, and knowing when to unpack information to their members and not unpack information to their members. You're right. Probably you've hit the bar high. I've been very impressed with what your association has produced. I said to Bidwell the other day, Paul Bidwell, I was impressed with the way the master builders have gathered information and disseminated it through their means too. So you guys have done remarkably well. You just got to keep it up, mate.
Yeah, and it's hard to maintain the rage, to be honest, over that sort of period of time. And the significance of that particular piece of legislation is that there's a deliberate intent within that legislation to force building companies to change the way they do business.
Yeah.
Now, we can debate the merits of that, but there is a deliberate intent within the legislation to force builders, principal contractors, to change the way they run their business. And that to me is significant, and it's not to be underestimated. And it has broad-ranging ramifications for the industry.
No question.
Yeah.
No question. And the smoky in that whole reform package, which was just approved, is the inquiry in terms of developers and where that's going to end up. It's the thing that contractors or the industry is going to have to get its head around is we just need to stop and think about. We can't regulate all the ills out of the industry. It just can't happen. It just there's personal responsibility, upskilling, due diligence, understanding what you should be signing, and your contractual awareness, and all that sort of stuff. But if we just keep on putting layer upon layer upon layer upon legislation, the industry will just end up saying, well, what's the point? It's an ageing industry anyway, demographically, in terms of builders. If you just keep on putting these regulatory hurdles, and I don't mind regulation, but it's got to be shown to be effective, and it's got to be clearly communicated to the industry what the impact's going to be.
I think you're absolutely right. You can't legislate against, to stop people going broke, as much as you'd like to think you can. And I'm also concerned about, some potential unintended consequences that will roll out because of the legislation. And I apply my town planning background to that. And the bulk of our industry is small business. the model that is being developed is based on the business practices of, you know, the bigger end of town, but it will affect our small business members who undertake the construction of townhouses and apartment buildings that are so desperately needed, or will be desperately needed moving forward, if we're to continue to house people affordably and in an appropriate manner. And the feedback I've got from our members that undertake that work currently is that if, you know, when this legislation is introduced, they'll simply stop building those type of projects. And so there's potentially broader ramifications. What does that mean for the housing supply in the state moving forward?
Particularly regional areas.
Yeah.
You know, it's, I shouldn't say, no one's more passionate about security of payment than I am. You mightn't be aware that, Joe, I was a sort of architect of the adjudication in Queensland. I was the adjudication registrar for years in terms of, so that's my background, and I'm very proud of what our adjudication has delivered in terms of cash flow benefits, not just for subcontractors, but for all contractors. So I'm not opposed to strategic, targeted legislation to bring about improvements. What we need to think about from this industry's point of view is it all just can't be down to governments providing solutions to these issues. It literally can't be. The industry is moving too fast for starters. Regulation is now struggling to be content, or to as we talked before, to reflect what's happening in the industry. And we've seen regulatory models totally break down. And the example I always love using is the regulation of the taxi industry. You had a regulatory regime in place. Uber didn't play nice, and just basically blew the regulatory regime out of because that is what the consumers demanded. They weren't happy with the existing licensed regulatory model, and you essentially saw a licensing fail by the marketplace just saying no, had enough. So
yeah, look, and you can't legislate against people who set out to do the wrong thing.
No,
they're all. It is. I have no doubt in my mind we will see people find loopholes in the legislation. I have no doubt in my mind we will have companies going broke under this model, and there'll be contractors who don't get paid. And in the meantime, we've impacted upon the business practices of thousands upon thousands of people who, by and large, do the right thing anyway.
That's the whole thing. Is it? I was looking at some stats today. About 1% of contractors have their licences suspended or cancelled by the QBCC for non-performance issues. So these aren't licences that are suspended or voluntarily handed in or anything like that. These are performance issues normally associated with the minimum financial requirements for licensing. That means 99% are doing the right thing.
Yeah.
But 99% are put through the same rigour as the 1%.
Yep.
Michael?
It is my frustration that, I'm led to believe that our regulator is aware of the repeat offenders in the industry. As an association, we don't support people who do the wrong thing.
No.
So for the benefit of the industry, boot them out.
Yep.
And look after the people who are doing the right thing or genuinely trying to do the right thing. It's a great industry, and it continues to be tarnished by repeat offenders, unfortunately.
Yeah. The QBCC is moving to this risk-based compliance and enforcement, which I totally support in terms of the use of big data and all that sort of stuff. So I know a lot of work's been done in the background of that. So if that means that they zero in on the rogues and leave the rest alone, boy, oh boy. Yep. All on board for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michael, look, I've taken up enough of your time. It's been a brilliant chat. I can't thank you enough for making your time available. I know there's a whole lot of questions there we haven't got through, but look, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll we cut these segments up, and I'm happy to feed them through to you for your marketing guys if you want to use them. We'll cut them up little segments relevant to whatever we talked about. But we disseminate it. We'll use this conversation lots of times through different social media forums. So thanks very much for your time, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks, it's been fun.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Stay well.